Everybody, good evening. Thank you for coming here through this delightful weather we're having tonight. And thank you for joining us for an exciting discussion of the origins of environmental law. My name's Steve Cohen. I'm the Executive Director of the Earth Institute and a professor of practice here at the School of International and Public Affairs. Now, as a faculty member and as a program director and as a former vice dean, I've been involved in curriculum development for a long time, and I have to say I was really excited when Mike Gerard, who I'll introduce in a moment, brought to me the idea of a course that would be taught by our speakers tonight, Leon Billings and Tom Jorling. And part of it was I remembered I worked at EPA in 1977 for a while when Tom Jorling was the assistant administrator, and back then I had a lot more hair. In fact, it was down to here. And I was a staff person on a working group on public participation in the water program. The Water Act was only 5 years old, and they were getting around to figuring out, oh, the public might actually be interested in this. We better develop some guidelines for how they can get involved in it. So that was what my work was on, and I was brought down there to help out a little bit. And one of the other things we're doing tonight, I should say, is these gentlemen have been teaching this course on the origins of environmental law, and we have a documentary being made of that course, which goes back to a time when we had a federal government. You might recall that time, and we actually were able to make environmental laws, which are really useful things to have. I just came back from Beijing, and I can tell you that clean air is a really nice thing to have. Even landing in New York, I was thinking, gee, I never thought I would think of New York City as a clean air haven, but compared to where I was leaving, it really was. Now, the class that these gentlemen teach is in this building Wednesdays, 11 to 1, and it's open to the public, so if you enjoy the discussion tonight, you can come and sit in and listen to them. I think I was able to make a few of the classes, and it's exciting and really interesting to hear about this experience, this very unique experience, I'm afraid, of working across the aisle. But before we start the discussion, I want to introduce our moderator, Professor Michael Gerard. Mike is the director of the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law, and he's the Andrew Sabin Professor of Professional Practice here at Columbia. He's also the associate chair of the Earth Institute faculty and a good colleague. He has practiced environmental law in New York City since 1979 and is probably the most prolific writer on environmental law in the United States. He's had a significant impact on the education of students here since his arrival, and I think in many respects is the reason why we were able to attract Tom Jorling and Leon Billings to teach with us. Now, the format tonight is Mike will moderate the panel discussion. There'll be some time for discussion from the audience. And then maybe about an hour from now, we have refreshments out in the lobby. Normally, I'd be offering you a nice view of the Empire State Building, but I think we'll be lucky to see the Church of St. John the Divine from here tonight, which is only a couple of blocks from here. But with that, let me turn it over to Mike, who will lead this fascinating conversation. Mike.
Thank you very much, Steve. The golden age of environmental lawmaking was the 1970s and the 1980s. Congress has not passed a major new environmental law since 1990. So all of us who've been practicing are practicing under laws that were written between 25 and 45 years ago, and most of them were actually written by the two gentlemen we have with here this evening. So it's as if we were taking a course on constitutional law taught by James Madison and Alexander Hamilton. So I'm going to introduce our two guests and put some questions to them, and then there'll be some time for Q&A from the audience, and the discussion will continue in the reception that will follow. So first, let me introduce Leon Billings, who is to my far left. Leon was the first staff director of the Senate Environment Subcommittee, which was controlled by the Democrats. In that job, he was primarily responsible for the Clean Air Act amendments, of 1967 through 1977, the Clean Water Amendments from 1966 through 77, as well as the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, key provisions of the National Environmental Policy Act, and the underlying liability provisions of the Superfund law. During much of that period, Thomas Jorling was the minority counsel and the key staff member for the Republicans in drafting most of those laws. Leon's career began as a lobbyist for a liberal-aligned trade association, progressed through his years as an environmental advisor to Senator Edwin Muskie, and continued as chief of staff to Senator and then Secretary of State Muskie. He served as the executive director of the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee in the 1982 cycle and was elected to the Maryland legislature, where he served from 1991 through 2002. After he left federal service, Leon created the Clean Air Trust and the Clean Air Trust Education Fund, both of which were dedicated to the preservation of underlying federal law, served as president of the Edmund S. Muskie Foundation, managed a politics program at the University of Southern California as an adjunct professor from 1982 to 95, created the National Caucus of Environmental Legislators, and ran unsuccessfully for Congress in 1986. Tom Jorling served with the Solicitor's Office in the U.S. Department of the Interior and the Counsel's Office of the Smithsonian Institution. He became minority counsel to the U.S. Senate Committee on Public Works in the spring of 1968. In 1972, Tom became professor of environmental studies and director of the Center for Environmental Studies at Williams College in Massachusetts, where he served for 15 years, interrupted from 1977 to 79 to serve as assistant administrator for water and hazardous waste at the U.S. EPA. In that capacity, Tom was responsible for the implementation of the Clean Water Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, and RCRA, and his office was also formulated the proposal for President Carter that led to the enactment of Superfund, which many of my colleagues regard as the Lawyers Relief Act. In 1987, Governor Mario Cuomo appointed Tom the Commissioner of the State Department of Environmental Conservation, responsible for the implementation of the environmental and natural resources programs in New York State, including, among many other things, the Adirondack and Catskill Parks. As Commissioner, Tom played a major role in the enactment of the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990, which together with the Oil Pollution Act of 1990 were the last many federal statutes Congress has passed in the environmental area. In 1994, Tom became the Vice President of Environmental Affairs for International Paper Company, responsible for environmental health and safety programs and forest policy programs for the company. Following his retirement from International Paper, Tom has been active on many nonprofit boards, including the board of the National Ecological Observatory Network, where he also served for almost as a year as CEO of this NSF-funded $500 million observatory. So I'd like to start with just a general question. Why were the 1970s and the 1980s so productive in terms of legislation? What was it about the members and the staffs and the dynamics during that era when so much got done, in stark contrast to what we see today?
I defer to old age.
I'm not sure whether the question isn't more why can't we do it today than how we did it then, but to respond in part to the question, Tom and I came up with a list of 25 different factors that have changed since 1970, 71, 72, the key years. We believe that those factors, the change of those factors, had a significant impact on the way Congress does business. We lived in an era where members of Congress, by and large, I would say fully 80% of the Senate and a similar percentage in the House, maybe even higher, believed that they were sent to Washington, D.C. to deal with problems. And so in that context, what we were able to do on the environment was work with members on both sides of the aisle. Our first step was agree that there's a problem, because if you don't agree there's a problem, you don't do anything. The second thing you do is try to find out whether you can reach an agreement on the federal role with respect to the problem. And once you get a consensus there, then you begin to craft the response to the perceived problem for which you've defined the federal role. In the case of the environmental statutes, this involved a relatively complex interrelationship between the federal government, state government, and local government. But the key was the word consensus. Ed Muskie used the word comity, that's C-O-M-I-T-Y, as opposed to today when they use the word C-O-M-E-D-Y. Comity was the rule that governed Muskie's efforts. He would not move without consensus, and he would take as much time as was necessary to achieve that consensus. Now, I think we're going to get a later question on what today is inhibiting that kind of behavior, so I'll stop there and let Tom put his 2 cents.
No, it's hard to recall that era beginning in '68 and running through '72 to narrow the parameters a little bit. It was a period of great turmoil in this country, and the situation was very accommodating to senators that wanted to solve problems, because the ones that they were being confronted with in their offices on a daily basis could not be easily solved. The Vietnam War being the principal matter that brought many of your previous generation to Washington. So it was a very tumultuous period. Now, if you ask what made it possible in that era, the subcommittee that Leon and I were privileged to serve only had 9 members, 5 majority, 4 minority. My patronage as the minority counsel was to a senator from Kentucky, John Sherman Cooper, but served also Howard Baker from Tennessee, Caleb Boggs, a name that probably none of you have ever heard, from Delaware, and Bob Dole from Kansas. Leon had 5 members, but what was unique in that era is there was no division on a party basis. And you ask, well, what was unusual? And one of the things that I would start with is the people. This group of individuals in 1968 through '72 enjoyed a kind of respect for each other that we were privileged to work with. And so while I was minority counsel, Leon served the majority. He served the minority just about as much as I did, and in some respects I served the majority. There was respect and trust across all of the members, and that was born of some also characteristics of this group of individuals. They had a deep sense of history. They had a deep appreciation of their role in continuing that history, and that, as Leon said, that their job was to solve problems. And certainly air pollution and water pollution were serious problems. One of the things that Leon had talked about our class, and I do want to make sure that we thank Steve and Allison and Haley, others on the staff, for the opportunity to teach this class. It has been very rewarding for us. So these members had just a tremendous respect for the notion, the concept of what it meant to be a United States Senator and the role of the Senate. I hope I'll get some opportunities to give some more flavor for that. But it was a group of individuals that we were very privileged to serve at a moment in time. When Leon mentioned the list of 25, we prepared that list in anticipation of the final classes that we're going to have toward the end of November and early December. And we'll be very particular about some of those, and I think we'll probably touch on some of them. Let me just touch on one that I think was very crucial to the conduct of the legislative process at that time that is not characteristic now. And that is, the real work in legislation is done in a part of the process which is called the markup. It's when the members get together to actually craft the legislation. Those markup sessions in this period were in closed session. They were not open to the public, and they were not covered by the public, by the media. And so in those sessions, the members had the opportunity to ask tough questions, questions that if they were in front of the camera, they would probably say, oh, I can't ask that question, I'll sound ignorant, or I'll sound naive, or I'll sound ill-informed.
Or stupid.
Mm-hmm.
Or stupid.
Or stupid. And it also provided an opportunity for Leon's boss, especially, although it became characteristic of other members, to take the role of the other, so that we would prepare materials, and the first thing that Muskie would do would be to rip it apart. He would ask us the toughest questions as if he were representing the industry or the other side. And he would do that because, as he stated frequently, I have to have an answer for every question that could be asked of me when this matter gets to the floor. So those closed sessions were exceedingly important to the understanding, to the education, to the learning that the members engaged in. And that opportunity does not exist in the current structure of the legislative process. They're now no longer closed sessions, they're open sessions, they're theater. Nobody does a learning experience in the markup sessions like we went through, and we probably could give you some flavor in the case of the Clean Water Act conference, which is the part of the markup sessions in effect between the House and the Senate to reconcile differences in bills. We had 39 sessions with members. 39 sessions, at least
With a quorum of conferees from both houses.
So they're together for 2 and 3 hour periods, 39 times, and thrashing out the details of that legislation. That opportunity doesn't exist anymore. So that's the kind of situation we were dealing with. It made life, should we say, difficult for staff because we were hit with these tough questions all the time. We had to have good answers, or if we didn't have one, we'd have to come back with one. So it was one of the fundamental differences. So I would mention those two things: the people, the members themselves. They were if you looked at their bios, a cross-section of American political people. Some of them were much more intelligent or bright than others, but they all had that common sense of purpose in solving problems and continuing the sweep of history of the United States.
So do you think that the current crop of senators see their role differently than those from your era then?
The situation has changed so dramatically, it's not possible to compare. Let me just give you an example. When Ed Muskie ran for the Senate the last time, in June of 1976, 5.5 years into his term of office, he called a lobbyist for the textile workers and said, a guy named Bill Duchessis, I was in the room. He says, Bill, I need to raise a little money for my reelection. And Bill said, well, how much you need? And he said, well, I think I need you to raise me about $100,000. I think I can raise the other 50 I need myself. And so Bill said, fine, I'll take care of it. In that period, the following 6 months, Ed Muskie never made a single phone call or attended a single one-on-one session with a contributor. He had bean suppers in Maine. They called them bean suppers, and they got $5 a plate off those. And, but they were political events. They weren't for raising money. He raised a little money at home, but not very much. So Muskie was able for 5.5 years to take those 3-ring binders that we created for him every night, take them home. He'd get up, because he wasn't big on the social set, he'd get up at 5 o'clock in the morning and he'd do his homework. And he'd come into the office prepared, and he would spend his day conducting the business of a Senate. Today, a senator has no time to be a senator. From the moment they're elected, they start fundraising for the next election. And you all can do the math easier than I can, but if you've got to raise $15 to $20 million for a Senate race, and campaign contributions are limited to a couple $1,000 per person and $5,000 to $10,000 for a political action committee, figure out how many hours it takes every day to raise funds for your reelection, and tell me, if you're over in a faraway office making phone calls to people and meeting to raise money, how much time do you have to attend hearings, to sit through markups, to discuss these situations with your colleagues? It is a totally different, and in my view, small c corrupted system.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add to that, we sort of thought people, media, and money were some of the categories, big categories of difference between now and then. And I'll say this in sort of a sense of sadness. I don't think any member that I worked for, and I would extend that over to the majority side, would be a candidate for public office in this era. They just do not have they did not have the kind of character or lack thereof to do what is necessary now to be an elected official. The first thing that now a candidate has to do is get trained so that people like Josh pointing a camera at them, they feel comfortable talking to an inanimate object. I know John Sherman Cooper, that was something he could never have engaged in. That was not within his sort of constitutional fiber. He could not go in a room with a camera and act like he's talking to another human individual.
Well, it was easy for you. With Muskie, we had to keep him away from the cameras because his temper was such that you didn't really want to have an unrehearsed moment.
So the people difference is great. These people had opportunities. At the time, we even thought, oh, they can't even compare to sort of earlier generations where public officials wrote their own speeches. That didn't even exist in our era. You gave them a draft of a speech, but they would go through it and make sure that they were comfortable with it.
But let me add that their debate on the Senate floor was extemporaneous. They would get into, Jacob Javits and Ed Muskie would get into a debate on some issue, and neither one of them have a note before them. They might have a staff person sitting with them, but for the most part, they didn't want to hear what we had to say. They wanted to engage in that debate. That has gone from our process, and that is a huge loss.
So do you see a pathway for Congress to return to functionality in this area?
Ooh.
Well, there are, Tom said, there are three things that are responsible for this problem. We mentioned money. Second is the way the media now functions, which is basically who are the best gotcha journalists, and so that the outliers, the fringe members of the legislature who in past times would never get the time of day on television have now become the spokespeople because the idiot factor is more important for selling airtime than the thoughtful factor. And the third thing is the Supreme Court. And in my view, until we reverse two fundamental directions of the court, the Supreme Court, when they amended the Constitution, in my view, to make corporations people, they changed the nature of our democracy. And secondly, they extended the rights of campaign finance to corporations. Until you change those two things, I don't think you can correct the problem.
It's hard. You know, one of the obligations, having spent 15 years as a professor in an academic institution, you always to remind yourself one of your primary obligations is not to basically cause this next generation to despair of progress. And so it's always difficult when confronted with a question like that. Are there some things that could change, that would restore it? And I think ultimately there are, but they're going to be very difficult. And I don't know sort of what the convergence of factors are that are going to cause that. But one of the issues is this, call it hyper-partisanship, but it's really not even partisanship. It's a kind of destructive orientation to public officials now that is quite pervasive. I know some of you may have read a piece in the New York Times Sunday magazine about 3 weeks ago, a piece by, I think it was Matt Bai, on the current minority leader, Mitch McConnell. And in that article, Mitch McConnell, at age 22, relates that at age 22, he served as a summer intern to John Sherman Cooper, and that John Sherman Cooper had significant influence over his life. And he even said that so much influence that he still wears the style of shoe that John Sherman Cooper wore. Well, I spent 4 years in very close proximity, both physically and intellectually, with Senator Cooper. And I can say that Senator Cooper, or that Senator McConnell, is the antithesis of John Sherman Cooper. For instance, one of the things that Minority Leader McConnell said not too long ago was that his primary duty was to defeat the President of the United States. That notion wouldn't have entered Cooper's mind. That was just something he would find so abhorrent and foreign, it wouldn't have even entered his mind. His view, and I can say many members of the committee, was he's our president, because we served at a time when we started this with Democratic president and concluded it with a Republican president. Members of both sides would say, he's our president. If the United States is to succeed, a president has to succeed. And therefore, you don't go around saying, my job as a United States senator is to defeat the president. That notion that a minority leader could state that his primary objective was the defeat of the President of the United States is a high relief example of this attitude that destructiveness is the objective. Now, why are they moving in that direction? That comment that he made got press. His interest in getting press isn't because of the content of what he says, it's the name recognition associated with it. And that's what these folks are rewarded with. They can get on TV by the strength of the negative, destructive comments that they make. And it is a deep flaw right now in our political process. Now, is it the problem of the senator, or is it the problem of the celebritization of the media? What is it the media reports? It doesn't report a tough issue. It reports, I attacked that person, so that gets good press and it gets good ratings. So that issue of what the media now cover and how they cover it is important. Just to give a contrast, Leon and I would spend considerable time with the kind of press that we had at the time, which was the written press, the writing press. There were several individuals who were great reporters, and we don't say that because they happen to maybe tilt towards protection of the environment, but on occasion, one of those individuals wrote for the New York Times. His byline was E.W. Kenworthy, affectionately known as Ned Kenworthy. After we reported the Clean Water Act in 1972, and this was a document of some substance, nothing like the statutes now, but probably 100 pages, he said, I need to understand this statute before I write about it. And so he said, come on down to the New York Times offices, and I went down there with the copy of the bill, and for 3.5 hours went through that line by line, page by page, so that he knew the strengths and the weaknesses of what was being proposed at that time. You don't have that kind of in-depth understanding and reporting by the media anymore. They're also victimized by this celebritization. They get reporters are now the subjects of reporting often, if you just watch the cable news. So these kinds of things might change if we can restore the orientation that the primary responsibility is to solve problems.
Let me ask you about some of the statutes that you were involved in writing. One of the hallmarks of U.S. environmental laws is the citizen suit, which most of the federal statutes you were involved in writing has, and it's played a